They thought he was just another slow old man holding up the line, a shivering shadow in a frayed bomber jacket, cap pulled low, waiting in silence at City Hall. If he's gonna sit there all day, at least he could wear something decent, the clerk muttered, tossing the worn fabric into the lost and found bin with a flick of her manicured fingers. She didn't bother to read the embroidery. 23rd Combat Engineering Battalion, Korea, 1952. She didn't see how Arthur Langley's knuckles tightened when she did it, or how his back stayed ramrod straight even as the line moved on without him. But someone was watching, and 10 minutes later, the doors to the records office burst open, not with a commotion, but with purpose. A mayor in full stride, medal in hand, flanked by aides who hadn't even had time to remove their press badges. Before we dive into what happened next, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe no veteran should ever have their service erased by ignorance, like and subscribe. Because this isn't just about a cap, it's about dignity that waited 50 years too long to be noticed. Arthur Langley had come in alone that morning, gripping a folder with dog-eared papers and a yellowing discharge certificate. No fanfare, just a quiet mission to correct a pension miscalculation that had shorted him for nearly a decade. The waiting room buzzed with fluorescent tension, toddlers crying, cell phones chiming, impatient sighs bouncing off cheap plastic chairs. When the clerk called his number, Arthur stood slowly, nodded to the woman beside him, and approached the desk like it was a battlefield, not because he feared confrontation, but because he expected silence. What happened next wasn't dramatic at first, just callous. The clerk, mid-scrolling through her phone, barely looked up as he handed over the papers. "You're missing a form," she said flatly, flipping through the stack. "I was told these were complete," Arthur replied gently. But the moment she noticed the cap, sitting respectfully on the edge of the counter, her tone changed. "Sir, can you please keep personal items off the public desk?" Before he could respond, she picked it up and tossed it into the plastic bin behind her, muttering, "This isn't the VA." Arthur didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He simply retrieved the cap, brushed it off with slow hands, and sat back down. But Jamie, a 24-year-old intern from the council offices across the hall, had seen everything. And she'd already sent the clip to her father, the deputy mayor, along with 6 words. "You said Arthur Langley built the bridge. The one they drive over every day. The one that still bears the bronze plaque with his name, mostly covered in moss now." 10 minutes. That's all it took. 10 minutes of silent humiliation. 10 minutes of busy, bored government workers forgetting who was in the room. 10 minutes until the front doors swung open and in walked the mayor, not with cameras, but with conviction. "Mr. Langley," she said firmly, stopping at his side. "We never gave you what you earned. But that changes today." The clerk blinked, confused. The other office workers froze mid-keystroke. The mayor reached into her coat, pulled out a velvet box, and knelt. "This is the city's Medal of Civic Engineering and Humanitarian Service. It was created in '92. You should have had the first one. I'm sorry it took us this long." Arthur didn't move at first. He looked at the box, then at her, then at his cap, creased now from the bin, threadbare at the edges, and slowly stood. "I didn't come for medals," he said quietly, his voice lined with sand and iron. "Just trying to get my paperwork straight." But now, the room had changed. The clerk who threw the cap looked down. The people in line stood still. Even the child who had been crying earlier stopped, sensing the silence that falls when someone finally gets seen. Arthur reached for the medal, not with pride, but with grace. "Let's sit down and finish your claim," the mayor said. "My office will walk it through." And when Arthur walked back to the desk, cap in hand, the same clerk who had mocked him moments earlier stood up, then handed him a chair, softly saying, "Sir, I didn't know." Arthur nodded once. Most people don't. That's the point. Outside, a few more people had gathered. Someone from facilities had started clearing moss from the bridge plaque. And later that day, the clerk's desk had one new rule posted. If you don't know what something means, ask. Don't throw it away. Arthur Langley didn't return the next day, but a letter arrived in his place. "Appreciate the medal," it read. "But I've got one already." Came with a bridge. There's a kind of silence that follows public shame. It's not the quiet of peace, but the hush that hangs when a room realizes it looked away for too long. After the mayor presented the medal, the front office of City Hall didn't go back to business as usual. It couldn't. People whispered as Arthur Langley walked to the back corner of the waiting room. Metal box tucked under one arm, cap now smoothed and resting once again on his head. It wasn't pride that made him walk tall. It was the quiet return of something long denied: respect. And while most eyes followed him, not everyone just stood there. Jamie, the young intern who started the chain reaction, stepped outside, her phone buzzing nonstop, text from staffers, friends, even strangers, asking about the man with the cap. She posted the short clip she'd taken, just 30 seconds of truth, captioned simply, "This is Arthur Langley. He built the bridge we drive across every day." Today, someone threw away his hat. Within the hour, the post had over 40,000 shares. Local reporters arrived by noon. But by then, Arthur was already gone back home to his modest duplex, where his living room was more workshop than lounge. Stacks of sketches, blueprints, and rusting tools laid out like memory maps. He hadn't expected any attention, didn't ask for interviews. When the first call came from a city planner who wanted to sit down and talk infrastructure, Arthur chuckled and hung up. Bit late, he muttered to no one, sipping his afternoon coffee. Meanwhile, at City Hall, the fallout was gathering like a storm. The clerk who tossed the cap, Leah, sat behind her desk, pale and rigid, barely blinking as the department director entered and shut the door behind her. She wasn't fired, not yet, but the mayor had ordered a full review of civic staff behavior protocols. "It's not about punishment," the director had said, "it's about what we represent. You can't throw away someone's history because you're in a hurry." And Leah, who had never felt the weight of the word service until now, simply nodded. But it wasn't just about her anymore. Because by mid-afternoon, something unexpected happened. A group of veterans began arriving. Not loudly, not with signs. Just one by one. First a man in a Desert Storm jacket, then a Marine in full dress blues, then an older woman who once trained medics in Vietnam, walking slow but steady with a cane covered in pins. They sat quietly in the lobby, not protesting, just being present. By the time the mayor returned from her council session, 24 veterans lined the hallway. Someone had left a sign on the front desk that read, "We wear what they earned." The air had shifted again. And then came the moment no one expected. Arthur Langley returned, not for glory, but for his paperwork. He entered through the east side door, not realizing what had happened in his absence. When he stepped into the lobby and saw all those uniforms, those quiet faces turned toward him, he froze. Not out of fear, but out of deep, stunned humility. Jamie rushed up first. "Sir," she said, breathless, "they came for you." Arthur shook his head gently. "No, they came for what that cap stood for." Slowly, he made his way through the crowd, handshakes offered and taken, salutes returned not as obligation but as language understood between those who had carried the same weight. One veteran, a young woman with a scar just visible near her temple, handed him a folded note. "Thank you. You reminded them we're still here." And finally, as if drawn by fate or maybe justice, Arthur stood once more at that same desk, Leah now standing, stiff and shaken. She looked at him, this time not as an inconvenience, but as a man who had walked roads she would never understand. "I'm sorry," she said, voice cracking. "No excuses. Just, I didn't know." Arthur studied her, eyes steady, kind but firm. "Then learn," he said simply. "Not about me. About all of us." He handed her the same documents she had tossed aside earlier. "Let's finish this." And she did. Thoroughly, carefully, every form reviewed twice. Not out of fear, but out of a new understanding. When they finished, Arthur stood, offered her a nod, and turned to go. But before you reached the door, the mayor stepped forward once more. "One more thing," she said, holding out a rolled-up certificate. "The city's new civil engineering internship program? We're naming it after you." Arthur paused, one eyebrow raised. "Internship." The mayor smiled. "Someone's got to teach them how to build things that last." And Arthur, for the first time that day, chuckled, deep, real. "Then tell them this," he said, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Don't build for applause. Build so no one has to ask who kept the water out when the river rose." He stepped outside, cap tilted just slightly against the breeze, leaving behind a building forever changed. Inside, no one tossed anything else that day, not a name, not a story, not a cap. Because dignity had walked in, claimed its place, and left footprints that wouldn't wash away. The days that followed weren't loud. No parades, no spotlights. Just a ripple, a slow, steady shift in how people walked, how they spoke, how they looked twice before judging what they didn't understand. Arthur Langley didn't return to City Hall again. Not because he held a grudge, but because he'd done what he came to do. He'd filed the paperwork. But his name? It stayed. Not just on that certificate the mayor handed him or the new engineering internship program that would bear his name, but in the way people now paused in the lobby where it happened. A quiet sign was installed behind the reception desk. Please remove hats only if they don't carry history. The plaque below it read, Langley Lobby, in honor of things we almost threw away. Leah, the clerk who had once discarded his cap like it was clutter, now kept the folded flag on her own desk, gifted to her, anonymously, by one of the veterans who had come that day. She didn't speak of it much, but every morning she touched the corner of the case before starting her shift. She knew now that respect doesn't always come easy. It has to be built, slowly, like bridges. And the bridge Arthur had built decades ago? It was now the site of something unexpected. City workers had scrubbed the moss from the bronze plaque that bore his name, revealing the engraved words, Arthur Langley, Lead Combat Engineer, Korea, 1952. Below it, someone had etched, quietly and unofficially still standing. No one reported it. No one dared remove it. But perhaps the most profound moment came a week later, at a local elementary school, when a group of fifth graders invited a guest speaker for Civic Week. They didn't pick a firefighter or a council person. They picked Arthur Langley. At first, he politely declined. But when Jamie showed up with a handwritten stack of letters from the kids, each one ending with, "We want to learn from you," Mr. Langley, he put on his old jacket, placed the cap carefully on his head, and showed up at 8 a.m. sharp. He didn't talk about medals. He didn't talk about war. He talked about integrity. About what it meant to do your job well when nobody's looking. About the time he stayed up for 3 straight nights reinforcing a river levee before a typhoon hit because I didn't build it for me. I built it for the families who hadn't even moved there yet. The kids didn't fidget. They didn't zone out. They listened. One even cried. Afterward, they gave him a handmade bridge model, cardboard and glue and colored paper, and on the bottom, scribbled in green marker, it said, "For the man who taught us how to stand tall quietly." When Arthur left the school, he didn't say much. But Jamie said she saw him sit in his car for a while, holding that paper bridge like it weighed 1,000 pounds. As for City Hall, they didn't just change signs, they changed policies. Veterans with business at the office now had a dedicated liaison to assist with documentation and benefits. Training seminars were held quarterly, titled, Every Cap Has a Story. Leah volunteered to lead the first one. She began her presentation not with an apology, but with a photo, Arthur, sitting in the waiting room, cap on his lap, eyes forward. "I didn't recognize him," she said, voice calm, steady. "But the point is, I didn't try." Back at his home, Arthur kept working. Not on bridges or petitions, but in the small backyard shed he had converted into a workshop years ago. That's where he built his models, scaled, detailed, perfect little blueprints of everything he once made for real. One day, a city planner knocked on his door holding one of the student bridges and asked if he'd consider helping with a Riverwalk expansion. "Just need someone who still builds with soul," he said. Arthur smiled, then handed him an old ruler that had his initials carved into the edge. "If you use this," he said, "measure twice, but never measure a person by what you see first." The planner didn't quite understand it at the time. But later, after reviewing Arthur's old blueprints and reading the faded notes scribbled in the margins, always signed "Built to Hold, Not to Impress," he got it. And when the ribbon was cut on that Riverwalk expansion months later, there was no grand unveiling. Just a bronze bench at the halfway point, facing the water, with a metal cap bolted gently onto the armrest. Next to it, a plaque with 7 words, "For the builder who never needed credit." Arthur never asked for attention. He only asked for people to do right when the moment came. And when he passed, peacefully, years later, with the cap folded beside his bed and that paper bridge from the school still pinned to the wall, the city didn't mourn loudly. It remembered quietly. Flags lowered. Children paused at the bench. Leah, now a supervisor, led a silent walk across the bridge Arthur had built. And Jamie, now a councilwoman, stood at the edge, holding his original folder of paperwork, the one he had brought that day. "He came here to fix an error," she said. "But what he really fixed was how we see each other." And so, the man who once walked in alone left behind something that never would be, a reminder that dignity doesn't demand attention. It earns it, cap by cap, bridge by bridge, choice by quiet choice.